Thank you very much. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to hear the case study of functional beds availability. And Mawande Ngidi, who is a project manager in the delivery support unit from the Gauteng office, will take us through that, but also supported by Angela Bester, who's a long-term advisor at GTAC. Over to you, Mawande.
Thank you, Tabo, and good morning to all the panelists as well as the people at home. My name is Mawande. I am with the Office of the Premier within the Delivery Support Unit, and I was, during this period of the past year, the Program Project Manager for the Health Infrastructure workstream. We're going to be taking you through a case study that's been undertaken by Ms. Angela Bester on what has worked basically in the response in the provision of functional beds. What I will focus on is more of the role of the Office of the Premier and the coordination role that we played within the infrastructure workstream. So if we can go to the first slide, Angela. Thank you. I must say from the beginning that the health infrastructure workstream was set up. It was originally under the comprehensive health workstream, which is where it resides, but a special focus was placed on health infrastructure from the onset by the Premier and the Director General, and it's under their leadership and that this work stream was constituted. Angela, I'm still on the first slide. So when we started planning for particularly health infrastructure, it was around March 2020. And there was a range of modeling that was done, and Mr. Mbada spoke about the modeling, and Graham and the team also spoke about the modeling that was done working with several partners. And this was fundamentally to determine the approximation of how many beds we may need based on the predictions for COVID-19. So quickly after that, the DG commissioned a baseline to be undertaken and a gap analysis, and then a plan to be developed to roll out beds for COVID-19 across the province. What quickly dawned on us, or the DG specifically, is the fact that we can't just be looking at infrastructure. We have to look at functional beds. And a functional bed consists of three major components. That is the infrastructure, the health technology or the equipment that is required, as well as the human resources. To basically meet patients' needs when they get to hospital. So again, a health infrastructure work stream was set up. One of our first goals was to look at the various models that were being presented, and then just hone into a target of how many beds we think we would need, and then a rollout plan was established between various departments. So the Office of the Premier, where Mr. Sigat mentioned that he was the chair of the health technical team, and I was playing the role of the overall project manager. We, from the Office of the Premier, then got to work pulling in different stakeholders to make sure that the vision was delivered. And I think we managed through a lot to deliver one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in health in the province. Many mistakes were made. There's a lot of learning that's been done, but I think overall that the response has been positive. If you can go to the next slide, please, Angela. Yeah, so I just wanted to, by this slide, highlight and give like a context to how the health work stream coordinated by the Office of the Premier worked. And what you find, or what you see here, and maybe this should have been the first part, because the work stream was set up first, and this work stream was chaired by the Director General and the MEC of Health, and we'd meet daily to monitor progress, troubleshoot, and fix issues HODs were present, and they had to present the different strands of work from their departments. But then when the ball started rolling, the DG saw that, look, because she needs to focus on other priorities, a health technical team, which was headed by Mr. Sidat, was set up. And that's where the real day-to-day work, we meet on a daily basis throughout the week with different departments. I mean, the work that was done here was more that the plans were developed, and we'd assist, coordinate the different plans. So within the departments of health, where they needed to provide the HR as well as the health technology, and sign off on infrastructure projects, as well as the coordination of the different projects and how that rolled out within DID, to bring it all together into one picture so that we can have a kind of visual or a dashboard of where we are at any given time in regards to the number of beds. So as I mentioned, GDOH or the Department of Health was the main planning department and the client departments to the Gauteng Department of Infrastructure Development, which became the implementing agent, and Gauteng Treasury was obviously giving advice on finance and procurement, and us as the OOP would provide oversight, issue identification, problem solving, and data verification mechanisms. So the work that was done on the health infrastructure technical task team would then be presented at the work stream. Comments would come back, or issues would be raised. These work plans would be refined, and then they'd be implemented by the various departments. Through this process, we monitor implementation, troubleshoot, as well as problem solve. And then the work came together and was reported to the infrastructure work stream, as well as then reported to the Provincial Disaster Management Council, and ultimately to the PCC, which is the ultimate decision-making body, as was mentioned by Mr. Mbada and Crane. So the decisions that were then taken at PCC would filter back into the day-to-day work of the health infrastructure work stream, and the process would start again. We do this at least twice a week. So as was mentioned, it was a bi-weekly session, and we'd have to meet and coordinate and problem solve and troubleshoot on a daily basis. If you can move to the next slide, please, Angela. So this is what I was trying to illustrate here, is what a typical work stream meeting or technical team meeting would look like. So on the top left-hand corner would be our gathering of information and data to give us a clear picture of where we are. And this came from the partnerships that Mr. Mbada was speaking to in the beginning with the different entities, the GCRO, the universities, where they gave us this ability to then analyze or track trends, looking at the new cases, how many active cases there were, hospitalization rates, what level of risk we were at any given time, so that we could, in an agile manner, open up and close beds to best benefit the total healthcare system, bearing in mind that we were chasing COVID. On the top right-hand corner, you'll see, so after we look at the data, we then go and look our facilities. Do we have beds? Where are the issues? Are the issues around infrastructure in this facility, health technology, or human resources? And then we looked at, for example, the outstanding projects. So there was a number of projects that were being rolled out, some major refurbishments, other minor refurbishments, and the building of totally new facilities through alternative building technology, which was undertaken. And I think that alternative building technology project, at the end of it, will yield us 1,400 critical care beds at the moment. 950 of those beds have been completed, and there's just an issue with 1 or 2 projects being delayed. We then have a look at deep diving into a specific facility. So what I have on the screen there is, for example, Jubilee. And if you look at the high-level dashboard, we'd see that at the time, Jubilee's infrastructure was okay, the health technology was available, and one of the critical issues was HR. So we then have a look at a dashboard like this for each of the facility, and looking at the high-level dashboard, we'd be able to move meetings from speaking about everything to more focus on the issues and where we need to problem solve. And then obviously a deep dive would be done, work plans would be developed, and then people will go away and the cycle would start again. That was indicated in the previous slide. So I think that's where I am. That was just to give you a context or a background into how the health infrastructure works through it. And Ms. Bester will be giving you a case study of what she found in speaking to the various stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mawande. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're quite audible.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me continue. So just to introduce myself, I'm Angela Bester, and I'm a long-term advisor, recently joined with the GTAC. I've come into this process rather, towards the tail end. And so the case study, we're still working on the case study. So what I'm sharing with you are my, the emerging themes, I'd hesitate to call them findings at this point. So this is still early days, but I'm comforted by what I heard from previous presentations earlier today and yesterday. Some of the issues that I've picked up seem to resonate with those that have been mentioned earlier. So for the case study, we used the following sort of overarching lines of inquiry or questions. And really what we're interested in understanding is what enabled the delivery of the functional beds in such a short space of time. As Mawande has pointed out, it's a large number of beds. We know infrastructure by nature is very difficult to deliver in a short space of time. So what enabled this delivery? What worked well? We also wanted to understand what did not work well, what constrained the delivery, and very important, the role and contribution of the Office of the Premier to this process. Mawande has given you an overview of the structure, but what we wanted to understand at a deeper level, what value the Office of the Premier added to the process. And then what can we learn from the crisis? Key lessons to be learned, and then how can the model be replicated? Under what conditions? And I guess there's a pre-question, should it be replicated? So that in a nutshell is what we try to answer in this case study. We used, I shouldn't say we, I used semi-structured interviews of workstream members, and these were from Gauteng and National Health, the Gauteng Department of Infrastructure Development, Provincial Treasury, of course, the Office of the Premier, and also professional service providers. So these were members of the work stream and task team. There were also consultations, of course, with the delivery support unit. It's still a very small number, but I guess these are people we could access in a short space of time. So there were 8 interviews altogether. Currently still reviewing documents. And as you would have seen from Mawande's screen with all those charts, those are just some of the charts that are there. There's a large volume of information. And again, just a reminder that this is work in progress. So what worked well? One of the messages that came through from the interviews, and I've heard it over the past day and a half, is that there was a single priority. It was get functional beds and get them fast. I mean, that was the priority. That's what everybody was focused on. So having that clear focus for clear action. So that was the first thing. The second thing, there was a lot of talk about the composition of the work stream. Who was there? All the key departments were there, including National Health. and a lot was made of the chairing of the work stream by the Director General. And as you would have heard from the earlier presentation this morning, the quality of the leadership provided by the Director General. Another point that came through very strongly is that the work stream, as well as the technical teams, were tended by the very senior officials who had the mandate to act and, of course, instruct their departments to act. So here you had in the same room the most senior people involved in trying to get these functional beds. Of course, this work stream was in fact a sub work stream of the larger health work stream that you would have seen from the diagram that Carmel presented on the PMO structure. So this was a sort of a microcosm. But the composition of the work stream was a very important enabler of the process. The people I interviewed, the key informants, and again, this has come through in the discussions over the past a day and a half, was the very rigorous approach to project management. And this was a project. I wouldn't call it a program. It's a project. It was very, very focused and intense. And you know, when I interviewed people, you know, just listening to the pace of the discussion, I mean, it left me quite exhausted. But it was very focused and very intense, data-driven and evidence-informed. Mawande showed you some of the graphs that they produced and relied on. Data formed a very important part of the decision-making process. The monitoring was very rigorous. I understood from the key informants, you would present your report, it would be interrogated very, very thoroughly, and you'd be sent back to go and attend to things that perhaps weren't correct or needed more explanation. Also, if reports of the different departments didn't quite gel or contradictory, there was a process of having to thrash out and iron out these differences. What the project management approach also had an element of being adaptive or agile. So as new information or evidence emerged, they would change tack, you know, and that came through in, for example, around when it became clear that we did not need so many beds, so you wouldn't go have more, you know, the field hospitals. So that was another thing that worked quite well. The routine, there was a lot of talk about the routine of these meetings, daily contact, meetings twice a week, but in between there was a lot of contact. It was a 24/7 type of communication. And just listening to what the key informants were saying, the communication was unambiguous. You were told this is what was required, and that's, you know, there was nothing in between. It was quite clear what was required. The other thing that worked well was the escalation of problems. There was a mechanism in the project management whereby if there was a problem that couldn't be solved at the level of the task team, it will be escalated further. And what the sense I got from the project management approach, it was urgency. Do it now and not tomorrow. As a former government official, I encountered a lot of that can't be do it tomorrow or next week. Yeah, it was urgent, and one can understand because it is a crisis. So the key message was do it now and not tomorrow. Key informant spoke of the work stream as a platform for learning. It enabled learning to solve problems jointly and rapidly, how to change TAC, working across institutional boundaries. A lot of that had to took place, and also very important, accelerated the use of technology. A couple of years ago, you couldn't get a government official to have a Skype meeting. But now I think everybody's very familiar with the use of technology for meetings, for interviews, and for the business of government. So that was a very important thing that worked well. And then the use of data for planning and decision making. The PMO was very data driven, and those who were involved began to understand the importance of data for planning and decision making. Just looking at the role and contribution of the Office of the Premier, it became clear that the Premier has multiple roles. And I know Ismail this morning had nice words for these roles, but I've described them. There was the coordination role. I mean, that was very clear, coordinating the different moving parts that had to work together. Facilitating access to information, access to other decision makers, and quite interventionist, fixing things, knocking heads together is a term I heard, refereeing when departments were in dispute, and there was, my understanding, quite a bit of that. And the word unblocking was used quite often in the interviews. And so I thought, well, I suppose Office of the Premier as a plumber, drains get blocked, and it can be stinky work as well. So, auditor, monitor, checking the validity, veracity of data. The other message that has come through is that the Office of the Premier was strategically positioned to play this role. After all, it does have a mandate to coordinate and convene, and that's a given. The other aspect was its proximity to power that gave it authority to call others to account. Much was said of this proximity to the power of the Premier. So you as an official in the Office of the Premier could ask the HOD the HOD of another department to please shape up, but to put it politely. And even though the Office of the Premier were not direct decision makers, they were certainly well positioned to influence the decisions that were made in the work stream. Very, very influential in that, based on data, of course. And what worked well for the Office of the Premier is that they do have the big picture, so that they can see, unlike the line departments, each line department has a picture of what it's supposed to do. But the Office of the Premier, they had the overall picture, so they could see very clearly what the implications would be of actions or inactions by one of the role players within this system of the work stream. The final part of the Office of the Premier, much was said by the key informants, that what the Office of the Premier brought to the table was that expertise was very, very important, particularly the project management expertise, and they also had the technical expertise and being able to access that external expertise around data. But the other important part of the expertise that was mentioned is the political savvy that they brought to the table. They knew how to deal with the political aspects and understood that while it's largely a technical role, They had to understand the political dynamics that were taking place. And I thought to just share this message that from key informants, that they would not have achieved what they achieved without that. And they mentioned the coordination, commitment, and drive of the Office of the Premier. So that's how the contribution, the role and contribution of the office. But as you would have heard, many things, quite a few things that did not work so well. And here we can start with all those pre-existing weaknesses that we have in government systems. What COVID has simply done was to shine and just highlight how inefficient many government systems are, and not just here in South Africa, I'm talking globally. And so this project had to work against the internal silos and government hierarchies. And yes, I heard that we broke down silos, but I think it is just temporarily, they kind of still there. Weak and fragmented data systems. I mean, this issue came up very strongly. We know that systems in government, they are not what they should be. Huge data gaps, but I think it's not just systems. I think it's also the capability of officials to understand data and work with data. The track record in health and infrastructure planning and delivery is, from what I know, the bit I know, and I do not live in Gauteng, but it's not brilliant in most provinces. And I think earlier this morning, one of the speakers mentioned the legacy of failures in the health system. I mean, so this all baggage that impacts on things, the delivering of the beds, disaster preparedness, and I'm not talking about disaster management. I'm talking about being prepared for disasters. My sense for South Africa that it's not a high priority. We wait for the disaster to happen rather than be well prepared for it. And then the capabilities of officials. I think we've probably been saying this for years, but it remains a major constraint. I find it baffling that we have to have HODs sitting in meetings twice a week when that work should be done in my view, by other officials. We should have capable officials. It's an issue that came up across the board with the issue of procurement. And whether it's uncertainty about the emergency procurement rules, I would say, but Treasury said or Treasury didn't say, and a very strong risk aversion following the PPE scandal. And so many people said, we have to think, what will the AG say? We take these we do emergency procurement, and then the AG comes back at the end and said, well, you should not have done it that way. This was not an emergency. So the issue of the AG came up in several of the interviews. An area that it sort of got mentioned at various points in the discussions this morning. But officials would say we worked well, but, so there was big but. And a lot of this was around the interpersonal and intrapersonal issues. And there were comments like, yes, we achieved this, but they don't really understand my job or how my department works. When I say they, not necessarily Office of the Premier, but whoever else is in the work stream, it's always about the other. A huge, not complaint, but a comment that this is not the only work I have to do. I still have to do my normal job, and it's incredibly difficult to do so. A lot of pointing fingers. Yeah, we work, but it's those guys over there in that other department. They keep delaying things. It's not us. And what I picked up was a lot of fear in the system. You get the work done. You don't want to look bad. You don't want to be reported, and that came up very often. And finally, you have to be resilient and not take things too personally. Well, I don't know how one. These things are personal. So there are a lot of those interpersonal and interpersonal issues that I don't think we pay sufficient attention to. So some lessons learned, and I've read many reports as a government official and many workshops, and we talk about these are the lessons we've learned, but I ask, have we really learned them? Because we keep repeating the same mistakes. So my question is, here's some lessons, but are we ready and willing to learn? So first lesson, working on multiple priorities. It's not smart or efficient. I really believe in focusing on one or two, but how do you do that and still keep your normal business going? Yes, you need reliable data that must be verified for decisions, but sometimes we have to be realistic and work with good enough data. Being open to external advice and expertise, I mean, that came through very strongly with the in the work stream. I also believe there's a lot of talk about leadership, but my sense was we're talking about leaders at the top. Leadership is more complex. There's political leadership, technical leadership, there's collective leadership, and we haven't spoken much about the leadership at very local and institutional levels. So we need to be not just focus on leadership provided by DGs. Paying attention to the interpersonal and interpersonal dimensions, such as trust, openness to different perspectives, power, and very much. I didn't hear much about the health and well-being of officials who have been working under, I would think, very, very stressful conditions. So for me, those are some of the key lessons that are emerging. And then just finally, the question of can this be replicated and under what conditions? And the sense I'm getting is that, yes, it has potential for use in top priorities, but it would require taking on board a lot of those lessons. There are a lot of ifs, a lot of assumptions, and conditions that would have to be met. And for me, a very important one is that you must have capable officials at all levels. Because if you don't have capable officials, it doesn't matter what model you're following. So for me, that's a central one. There are issues, uncertainties around procurement rules. And maybe this is something the National Treasury and the aid needs to be resolved with the AG. And it came up with the procurement of infrastructure, which is complex, but I think there are other procurement issues as well. So it's something to look at. And then finally, we can't, if you want performance, we can't have officials driven by fear. And that's my sense. There's a lot of fear in the system. And I don't know if I could do a good job, get to work every day, even if virtually, if I have to work in an atmosphere of fear. So I think that's something we should look at quite seriously. So those are the emerging. There's still quite a bit of work to do on this case study, and I've taken quite a few pointers from the earlier presentation today. So thank you.
Then Angela. by bringing in those insights from the case study. We are now joined by our panelists to complement the discussion on this case studies. Mark Blecher, who is the Chief Director, Public Finance Health at the National Treasury, as well as Boitumelo Mashilo, who is the Chief Director, Capital Appraisals Unit. But Mark Blecher is ready to give us some insights. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, good morning, colleagues, Chairperson. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you for the presentation so far, and I do need to say that I don't work in Gauteng government, so the comments that I'm making are in a sense somewhat of a soft nature, but nevertheless, I do feel quite strongly about some of the issues. So let me start and say that, firstly, to acknowledge that Gauteng government, as all the other provinces, faced a massively difficult situation. Massive first and second wave, operating in a national lockdown, panic, enormous stress of health workers, facing very difficult conditions. And let me secondly acknowledge that the information that the planners were getting from the national modelers was changing all the time, and it was suggesting that there was going to be a massive breaching of ICU bed numbers and bed numbers. So in a sense, that also in a sense perhaps may have pushed excessive production of beds. So let me acknowledge those. But now I want to come on to a number of areas which are perhaps questions or criticisms which I think need to be thought about in the way ahead. So firstly, the title of this topic is functional beds. And I think we need to ask ourselves as we speak, how many of these beds that have been constructed are indeed functional? It was said that they need to be equipped, they need to be staffed. So as we speak now, going into the third wave, how many of them are in fact functional? And in fact, what we hear is that quite a number of the new beds constructed are in fact not functional yet. So that's a fairly significant problem. So this question of functionality is really important going into the third wave now, as Gauteng is. The second area that I'd like to come on to is the nature of the bed that was constructed, as opposed, particularly kind of considering kind of temporary field hospital solutions as opposed to semi-permanent or permanent beds, and the timeliness to construct those beds. Now, some provinces chose to focus more on short-term facilities that they could rapidly adapt, something like the International Convention Center in Cape Town or Nasrec in Gauteng. In other words, an existing structure, and looked at how it could rapidly be adapted to be able to provide services. Now, the problem, I think one of the problems that existed in Gauteng is this emphasis on semi-permanent or permanent bed structures that were then planned for construction. And the problem with that approach, that I think has emerged, is that many of these new beds that were constructed at substantial cost were not ready for the first wave. They were not ready for the second wave. And the question is, are they ready for the third wave? So, I think that's an important question. I think it's perhaps a strategic question, that if one's got an epidemic that is moving very, very rapidly, is it the right solution to construct, because normal construction takes a long time. So to start constructing facilities that are going to take 6 to 12 or 18 months, which were not going to be ready in time for the peaks, I think is the third area that I'd like to bring up, or question to bring up, is again, it links to this question of functionality. So, perhaps the real priorities was not so much the bed, but it was the oxygen, the equipment, and the personnel. And the question is, to what extent all of those are in place and are in place even now for the third wave, which is where they're obviously critically needed. And that's presumably where Gauteng is focusing right now. So we know that several of the new hospitals that have been constructed, even as we speak today, do not have those. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the personnel. So, and we already now in the third wave. So, so in a sense, I think this is a kind of common problem in health planning, where the infrastructure team is really working on one side, but is not adequately coordinating with the Treasury, the provincial Treasury, on the financing of the recurrent costs, the staffing, and the equipment. So that even now, one sitting with quite a number of constructed beds, which we understand are not fully functional. Now, Nasrec perhaps was an example of a facility that was temporary and could have been, far more functional. But even Nasrec, as far as we understand, many of the beds were not fully oxygenated. It has now been closed down. But we remember, even in the early days of Nasrec, there were, when Nasrec opened, there were questions about the availability of oxygen, whether specialists had to bring their own oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. So the preparedness of these. So I think this is to some extent a sequencing issue. Has Gauteng put too much emphasis on infrastructure and construction as opposed to these, to the personnel, the equipment, and the oxygen? We know, for example, that various donors have had to, contribute to equipment. The Solidarity Fund, I understand, has contributed several hundred million, or possibly even up as much as $1 billion. I don't know the exact numbers. We've seen even in the early days specialists contributing, which is not wrong, of course, but it does raise the question whether the province timeously was able to put those into place. A next point I'd just generally like to raise is, which links to Angela's point about leadership and who actually the leadership should include. And to my mind, Gauteng province, as the smart province, it has some of the best brains in the country. It has very strong universities. It has many, many specialists, many more medical specialists than other provinces. A lot of academic institutions. But in my experience, the relationships between the province and the academic institutions and the specialists are often not strong. And so that the province is not, in its notion of leadership, is not bringing in sufficiently the academic leadership and the professional leadership. And so that, we have picked up, huge numbers of criticisms from medical specialists around some of these facilities, for example, that they feel do not meet their needs. And I think that results partly because of what Angela's talking about, the nature of leadership and the kind of the alliances that are built, not just at the top between the Department of Health and the infrastructure and the Premier, but with the universities, with the specialists. So the broad nature of that leadership. Also to say that, there have been technical questions raised around both distribution of beds, where beds have been located, particularly new beds, but also the fitness for purpose of beds. Both their proximity to existing hospitals, how easily the functionality works, but even on the nature of the functionality of the facilities. So now going into the third wave, which is where Gauteng is right now, I think it's really important to look not just at the bed numbers, but to look at the functionality. To what extent are those beds functional? Are there sufficient functional beds, sufficient equipment, sufficient oxygen, sufficient personnel? Clearly also the role of rapid rollout of the vaccine program is really important. And if done rapidly enough, could in a sense nip the third wave partially in the bud. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much for those comments, Mark. And I guess this gives us an opportunity to move to Boitumelo to also share some insights to complement what has been discussed thus far. Over to you, Boitumelo.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. And look, I think that the workshop is both timely and relevant, and I think that Angela and Mawande have done a brilliant job of putting together a very insightful presentation that takes us through their case study. So, maybe one of the things that I would like to talk about is on the case study itself. Inherently, what a case study offers is an opportunity to reflect and identify lessons learned with a view to gauge if the results can be replicated or not. And I think that the presentation reflected honestly and robustly, and I also think that it identified the key enablers as well as the constraints and the conditions under which the results may be replicated. So I think kudos to the team for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to limit my input to 3 points. I had a few additional points, but some of them have been raised by Mark already. And the first one is that the expediency in the delivery of the functional bed was actually enabled by the use of bespoke, capacitated, and fit-for-purpose structures. And this is why the outcomes are very different from what we've become accustomed to in the public sector, where there is a lot of inertia in the system and things simply take too long to move. Now, for me, what this demonstrates is the fact that there was leadership, and the quality of the leadership, to me, was quite strong, and there was accountability, there was active involvement by key stakeholders, and there was a focus on a common cause, which Angela spoke about. And there was also a lot of agility and responsiveness because the target kept on moving. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is, in trying to replicate the success, we have to normalize what these bespoke structures actually enabled. And my view is that in how the Gauteng province seems to have gone about it, is that they created parallel structures. And I don't necessarily think that that is the best way if we want to normalize the anomaly. In other words, if we want to learn from what the bespoke structures have provided us, we don't always have to create parallel structures all over the place, instead of repurposing what is already in place. And linked to that is that the truth is that there was nothing really out of the ordinary that any of the stakeholders did during the crisis, because the Department of Health delivered a health service, DID provided infrastructure, GPP allocated funds and advised on procurement issues, and OTP provided oversight. The only difference here is the speed and the approach or the environment under which this was done. So I think that we need to find a way of instilling the same kind of discipline that we saw during the crisis as a matter of routine. And I would like to hear some of the ideas that the Gauteng government is having around sustaining this kind of momentum. Two is I really like the fact that the definition of a functional bed included HT and HR, because as everybody knows, that healthcare is a service. It's more than anything that is enabled by human resources, our skilled medical professionals, the infrastructure, the medication, the medical supplies, the labs, and many other support functions. And without necessarily touching on some of the issues that Mark has already spoken about whether some of these beds are actually functional or not. Maybe I can focus on trying to understand that in delivering the 4,000 plus beds, I'm sure there is a split between new beds and conversions. I would like to understand what that split is, and also the trade-offs that had to be considered, particularly in the case of conversion of some of the beds and the impact of that on the overall provision of healthcare. Again, what we don't want to end up with is resolving one issue at the expense of 5 other different problems that we are creating. Maybe the last point for me would be around procurement issues. And again, coming from GTAC, given its very close proximity to the National Treasury, it's not surprising that I do want to comment on the procurement. The weakness is that we did not follow our own rules and regulations that we all know are important in terms of compliance. And as a result, we're having to deal with corruption issues, irregular expenditure, and so on and so forth. And my question is, do you think that by following the legislative prescripts to the T would have undermined the expediency objective significantly? And I ask this because as we think about the future and whether the successes can be replicated, we have to review if and the extent to which compliance tracks from trying to achieve our objectives. Thank you, Chair, and over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for those insights. So the big issue that has come across from the 4 presentations, the replication. If we have achieved success in executing this project, the question is, can it be replicated? And I'll ask my colleagues here in the studio to comment about that issue, starting with Rashid.
Chair, if you don't mind, I got a couple of comments to make, and I will deal with the issue of replication, but so if I can just raise a couple of issues from what the panelists have said. I'm not going to say anything about Mawande. Mawande and I have worked very closely together on this project. I chaired the technical task team. He was the project manager. Mm-hmm. So whatever he's saying, I agree with. So there's no issue, and anyone else can contest what he said. Secondly, with regard to Angela, I know that Angela interviewed me, I think, last week, and I was a little skeptical about her ability to pull things together, but I think she's done a very good job in a relatively short period of time. And I suppose it's part of my job to be skeptical from where I'm sitting in relation to Ismail and Kamal. But Angela, well done on that. And I mean, I think I generally agree with the sort of the issues raised in relation to enablers and the role of the OOP. But I think the one question I just have for her is I'm not sure what she quite meant in working on multiple priorities in her lesson. So I just want that clarity. She went through fairly quickly, so I might have missed, I think, what she was saying, but that's my only concern on that one. Mm-hmm. Insofar as Mark is concerned, let me just say this, Mark. I do not mean to be defensive, but there's a lot that I disagree with you about. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to say that. I think that hindsight is a wonderful science. It's hindsight. It's now looking back and say, oh, well, you could have done this, you could have done that. I have to remind him and everyone else that we were dealing with a crisis. We were dealing with a situation. I mean, normally you should know better than anyone else how long it takes to, build alternative building technologies under normal conditions, how long it would take to set up a field hospital, which we never really do. As far as I know, maybe a long time ago, but certainly not in my experience in government in the last quarter of a century. I don't think we've done it. Maybe we have, but I don't know about that. And so hindsight is very easy to look at stuff. But I think that, in my view, I think you are wrong. Firstly, on the issue of functional beds, in Gauteng, our task team basically came to the conclusion that what we needed was functional beds. It happened organically, because our first, when we started the process, when we were running the technical task team, our main focus was actually on working with the Department of Infrastructure Development and the different components within the health department. We also had provincial treasury there and other parties, all of that chaired by myself. And as we were going through the process, we said, well, actually, you know, I mean, what we need to do is to stitch and knit these things together so that we can have a functional bed. Maybe the idea of functional bed has always been there, I don't know, but I don't know too much about health infrastructure, but what, I mean, I think we learned on the job that is in fact what we needed was a fully functional operational thing, right? So it happened organically, okay. And in fact, there was another work stream called, I forget what it was called, but it wasn't really functional, and we in fact took on that responsibility. And very early on in the process, not very early, it's a midway in the process, we basically began articulating these things. I also think that you're wrong when you say that we weren't ready for the second and the third wave. The first and the second wave. The first wave just hit us, okay. The second wave, we anticipated it, but like the rest of the country, we were about 3 weeks late. Everyone said mid-January. In fact, it hit in the last week, as you very well know, in the last week of December, and that's when the crisis, because on the day before my birthday, the president made the announcement, well, no birthday for Rashid Sirat on the next day. Just joking. So I remember the date exactly. On the 28th, he made the announcement on the 28th of December. So I think that, and we were able to actually deal with the influx with the private sector, working in conjunction with them. To say that everything worked well and perfectly, absolutely not. I think, like everyone else, but I think it's wrong to stand on a soapbox and say, well, you guys, I mean, actually messed up on many things. The issue, by the way, on the issue on field hospitals, I mean, that was an inexact science, and everyone knows it, right? Whether or not, how they were going to be used and so on. We had stopped the Tshwane Event Center on the day it went to tender. We told them, no, don't do the tender, because in fact, we're going to be wasting money, okay? We could have wasted several 100 million rand had we gone ahead, but who knew? Besides that, we had about 2 or 3 additional field hospitals that we were going to build. We basically said, just stop all of those, even before they got to the tender stage. So I'm saying that it was muddling through, everyone was muddling through, including the National Health Department, including National Treasury. So I'm just saying that it's, I think that our assessment, given everything else, well, I'm not talking about the PPE corruption. I mean, that was a big problem, and I think it's being and has been dealt with in the most decisive way. And so on some of those things, I mean, there's no justification for it, and in fact, the full might of the law and consequent management must take its place. But I think from where you're sitting, I disagree with a lot of what you are saying. I think what you need to be looking at is the level of detail and the nuance that actually happened almost on a daily basis to understand what actually happened. So, okay, I don't want to make this a dialogue, but I think it was quite a hard-hitting critique from your side. I think we have the right to respond. I hope I wasn't being too defensive on that. My final point in relation to Boitumelo, I generally agree. I don't know what you meant, and this is a point of clarity, by saying we created parallel structures. What does that mean exactly? So if you can just clear those points. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Rashid. But I think maybe Mark has got 1 or 2 comments before we go to Boitumelo to clarify on the parallel structures.
No, not at this point, Chairperson.
All right.
Thank you. But maybe just one last point, sorry, Chair, that I had wanted to convey that maybe I forgot that I would like to convey is that I think another issue that needs to be considered is the working together of the public sector and the private sector. So there was some work done nationally around creating a framework for contracting for critical care beds with the private sector. And Western Cape, I think, got fairly close to doing it and did it on a fairly small scale. But I think there are lessons in that moving to national health insurance. I think when one's bed planning, one should not just be looking at public beds. One should be looking at the total beds that are available and how you work with a mixed delivery platform and how you contract with all the potential beds that are available, as opposed to just starting from scratch to build. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Boitumelo, there was a question or comment seeking clarity regarding the parallel structures.
Yeah, so my point here is that, the work done through some kind of a task team that was composed of a number of key stakeholders, right? And this task team was put in place specifically during or as part of the response to the crisis that the province and the country was facing at that time. Normally, as a matter of routine, there are protocols or governance structures that are being used to plan for infrastructure within the province, whatever those governance structures may be, between the Department of Health and how it relates to the Treasury, between the Department of Health and how it relates with the infrastructure department, and so on and so forth. So what I'm cautioning against here is that, to me, it doesn't look like you took the existing structures that were in place and you tried to reconfigure or repurpose those for the sake of responding to the crisis. My view is that with the task team that ended up being the one that ran the work of delivering the functional bed, it was outside of the normal process. And so that's the clarification on the parallel structures. It's not that I'm saying it was wrong. All I'm saying is that we cannot respond every time with a different structure. What we should be putting a lot of emphasis into is making sure that existing systems, processes, governance structures, institutional arrangements work such that even in crisis, we can find ways of resolving issues that we are having to deal with without necessarily having to go and create something else. And I hope that clarifies the question. Well, the point.
Thank you very much, Boitumelo. Perhaps Mawande and Angela are in a position to address some of those points put forward. Any one of them can address those issues?
I'll just respond to the questions around, or clarification sought around prioritization. I was trying to make is that in government, we're not terribly good at prioritizing, and we try to work on so many different things at the same time. What this case study showed was by focusing on one thing we can achieve. Multitasking, in my view, isn't. In the end, it becomes quite inefficient. So the challenge for government is to take the few priorities and focus on those. And perhaps I'm going back to my past in government, where we have a program of action that is so long, because every department, every minister, everybody wants to be in there. And so things get bogged down. And so the point I'm simply trying to make is better prioritization.
Great. Thank you very much. And Mawande?
Thank you, Chairperson. And Again, thank you for the opportunity. I'll try to answer questions that have been raised by the colleagues. I'm not going to be able to answer some of them, as some of those answers lie with the line departments. But just on my side, to Mark and Boitumelo, I am in the Office of the Premier, as you know, and I think that what we were looking at in this case study is, one, the delivery of functional beds, as well as then the role of the Office of the Premier in a time of crisis and how to coordinate that. Now, looking more specifically at the role of the Office of the Premier, I think our Premier played very, very, very strategic, an extremely strategic role based on the data that he had available at the time, at any given time, for the response. So as a province, we've got an infrastructure build program and maintenance program that is linked to growing Gauteng Together 2030, as indicated by Mr. Bada in his opening this morning. So when COVID came, it obviously came as a shock. We didn't know what to do at the time, but based on the data, we were told you may need X number of beds. And the Premier then took this as an opportunity to not only service COVID, but also the long-term infrastructure maintenance and development program of the country. So maybe just a bit of context. When around May or March, when hospital numbers began rising, we had already put up NASREC, which had 1,500 beds at a field hospital. As the chair of the technical team had already alluded, there were already plans in place ready to go for an additional 5 or for another 3 or 4 field hospitals. We also had about 1,000 beds set up at provincial quarantine and isolation sites. This was something that was frowned upon, if you remember, for a bi-national government and other provinces to say that, you know, we've got this pool of quarantine isolation sites being managed by national. Why are you going to create more? But those facilities assisted us a lot in the first wave to understand quarantine, isolation, and hospital admissions. So when post the first wave, those facilities, we had created additional capacity in our facilities. A lot of those facilities were closed down. In the second wave, we had expanded additional capacity, and thus NASREC was closed down as a field hospital because that capacity at NASREC, as well as the equipment and human resources, were moved to additional beds that were open. So it was a process of what is needed at the time. What is the data saying? Okay, the data is saying now we are at a downturn, therefore we don't need this facility, shut it down. Let's move the resources that were stationed here into our permanent capacity in which we've created. The issue around oxygen, that is something that as a technical task team, we've got daily meetings with AFROX. There's currently a program that's running that just needs to be finished up on improving the infrastructure for oxygen in provinces, or not in provinces, in our facility. All the equipment that we need for all the beds that have been opened is available. It's been delivered, it's been installed. The latest facilities that have been opened, again, if I'm hoping you know, is a 150-bed facility at Bronkhorstspruit, fully equipped. Anglo Ashanti, the donation, fully equipped. Krisani, Baragwanes, Alternative Building Technology Program, fully equipped. Jubilee Alternative Building Program, which is on the sites and precincts of these different hospitals, are all fully equipped. Then in terms of bed numbers, we were speaking recently with hospital CEOs on the plan for the third wave. And as a province, we can confidently say we have about approximately 4,265 beds functioning, meaning they have everything, the human resources, the equipment, and HR. There's another about 800 beds that came online in the past 2 weeks. Those they are posts so they've been fully equipped, and they are posts that are available for equipping or for staffing those facilities. But should the need arise, and we are hoping that it won't arise to the extent that we need to use all our capacity. So currently, speaking to CEOs, they had set aside, as we speak, about 3,000 beds for the COVID response, knowing that we can shift upwards, and there are plans to do this. We've done it from lessons in the first wave. We did it in the second wave, and now we've said that 3,000 beds have been set aside for now. And the decision to set aside these 3,000 beds is because the admissions have been low for COVID. I think over the past 2 weeks, we've been averaging about 300 COVID patients in facilities. So the other about 1,200 beds could carry on providing services that have been shut down through the COVID period. And now they have the ability to be reopened with enough consultation to the public, which is another important thing. We can't just open up. We have to speak to the public and tell them these procedures will now be slowed down because we are ramping up based on the data showing us that we got a third wave. So in summary, I think, as Angela said, it was a very data-driven process. We were starting from a base where we weren't sure what was going to happen, and a lot of agile decisions needed to be made by the strategic leadership of the province in order to get us to where we are, of not really having had people lying on corridors not being tended to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mawande. It will be also interesting to hear from other provinces if they can tune in and share their experiences. But on that note, Ismail would like to offer some few comments.
Thanks, Chair. Just to comment, I think the kind of achievements that Mawande is talking about, I think we wouldn't have been as prepared if the Office of the Premier didn't use its positional role to bring the parties together, to problem solve and to address the challenges that they were confronting. I think Mawande mentioned, but if we look at the news reports and early reports we've got from Italy around people in corridors and people in parking lots, later the situation in Brazil, and recently the situation in India, I think we were scared of reaching that point. But I think even though the health department has so many challenges and structural problems, as we heard in the previous case study, the health system did not collapse. It coped. We didn't have a situation where people were treated in parking lots or lying in corridors. And I think we also need to note, although coordination happened at the provincial level, I think we also need to recognize the role played by CEOs of facilities and clinicians. I mean, they are absolutely on the front line, and we're taking daily, hourly decisions, life and death decisions about reconfiguring their institutions, of moving beds from one side to another, of creating isolation zones. So I think we must also recognize the role played by the CEOs, management of health institutions, and the clinicians, who played an important role to ensure that we are able to cope, and we didn't see the disaster situations that happened in other countries, just to make that point.
Great. Thank you very much for those comments. And Kamil?
Yeah, I think similar to Ismail, and firstly, just thank you to everybody that contributed to the discussions this morning. I think very early on, Angela made the point that this is still a work in progress. So we've just recently started to write it up. But we, just through the work that we have been doing, and especially with Mawande's involvement from our office, we knew that there was some gold, if I can put it that way. And now it sounds like I'm patting ourselves on the back, but in a way we are. And it's not only for the purpose of showcasing what has been done, but it's actually about saying what can we take forward with us. So very similar to what we said in the earlier discussion. What are the lessons that we want to take forward? So, as Rashid says, hindsight is kind of now the perfect sight, and we can now look back and say, had we known this or had we done that? However, sometimes, as Angela also said in her presentation, sometimes you have to make decisions based on the information at hand, and at that point it has to be good enough. for you to make a decision. And sometimes it's not good enough, but you're under such severe pressure that you don't have the luxury of not making a decision. And I guess that's where leadership comes in, that you kind of have to say to yourself, on this one, we have to bite the bullet. So I think our response was agile and we were responsive, as we said in the presentation. Boitumelo, we take the point. It's not the ideal to kind of set up what you refer to as the parallel structure. But in a way, I think if we hadn't done some of the things that we had done and set up the structures that we had and kind of managed them in the way from the office of the Premier, we would not have been able to achieve some of the achievements that we have. And that is because there were there are structural, there are deep-seated issues within health. And to land a crisis on top of that and then say, you guys with the existing structures, you manage, it would not have worked. I think similarly, even the infrastructure development department. So, in a way, it was about saying, and even to the point of how we collaborated with the private sector. Again, probably, in fact, I'm sure we could have done a lot better on that score. But, all eyes were on government at that point, and we needed to respond in the best possible way that we could, based on the information available. So I think what we're trying to do now is to kind of take a deep breath. We are not through the crisis. We are faced with the third wave, and I think Mawande responded he responded really well to how we are setting ourselves up. And I think part of that for me is showing some of the learning that we've had previously. I mean, we didn't have time to do any kind of learning or anticipation with the first wave. It happened, And were the 4,000 beds ready at that point? No, they weren't. However, we were able to cope at that stage. And so I think as we now as we're progressing and in fact, in the third wave now, we have learned from the experience we've gone through in the 12 plus months and able to prepare for that. So I think what we're trying to do now is to say, as we're responding to that, we also want to take a bit of a breath and say, whilst we're still going through this experience, and whilst some of it is still fresh in our memory, we want to capture some of it, and that's what we're doing right now, just so that we have the record. But then out of capturing that is then to say, so what is it that we did well, that we want to hold on to and that we want to take forward with us? What is it that we need to reflect on deeply and that we need to work on and improve? And in particular here, we're looking at the regulatory lapses that happened, in particular around the procurement issues, for example. So I think that's what we're trying to do. But at the same time, and I would really like to hear some other voices, in particular from our colleagues from other provinces, because at the same time we want to share some of this, with our colleagues, but we also want to learn from them, because I think there was a question to say, so the colleagues in the studio, what are you guys going to do going forward? And part of that, we're hoping we can also learn from what's happened in other parts of the country and in other provinces. So, yeah, that would be my view. Thank you so much,
Great.
Chairperson.
Thank you very much for that, Kama. And to wrap up this discussion, perhaps each panel can say a few words regarding going forward. It would have been ideal to also hear from other provinces. What lessons are we taking forward, given that we are faced with a possibility of a third wave? What can we take forward from this? Mawande, few comments from you.
Thank you, Chair, again for the opportunity. I think what we really taken forward, and is something that we resolved on as part of the work that we continuously doing with the Department of Infrastructure Development and Health, is to keep a system like the work stream. And we've had appetite from both health and DID to continue a system like a work stream, maybe not as intensively, but a check-in for all of us, because what we found is sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And that is what the work stream and the coordination work of the Office of the Premier has been at its core, being able to bring people that are critical stakeholders towards achieving a program around the table for them to solve problems jointly, as opposed to say, and this is something I always say is, what did you do? I sent an email, and then what? And then it's crickets, we did nothing. So the sense of urgency and, following up using data to inform your decisions and making sure that we're doing it within the regulatory confines so that none of us land up in trouble. I think for us as Gauteng, that is definitely something that we are taking forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Angela?
Well, my task is to complete the case study. And I've, listening over the past day and a half, I've picked up some very valuable pointers that I think we could amplify in the case study. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and it's something I'll discuss with the Office of the Premier, is what do we put in place to do some ongoing monitoring of how this thing continues, to unfold. So that's something I'd like to, maybe it's GTAC we could discuss. And then I, just taking on the point that Boitumelo raised about parallel structures, I think it's an important point. I did some work years ago with the IDMS and IDIP and all of that, and I thought we had all those structures there to do precisely what the work stream has done, maybe perhaps under more normal circumstances. But that's, there is that structure, and perhaps we should be having a closer look at the infrastructure frameworks, the IDMS, and all those pieces. Are they still speaking to one another? Just something, perhaps GTAC, whoever's, Boitumelo, is that something we should look at? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mark?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you for the inputs. And, it looked like, for example, Northern Cape, their numbers are already growing quite high, and it does look like Gauteng is potentially going into a third wave. And so we really wish the province well with its preparations for the weeks ahead. And if we're dealing with a potentially escalating caseload, I do also like the way that Mawande laid out the 800 beds that are currently, they've come online, those that are currently available, and those that are potentially available to scale up. And I think it would be quite useful to, in a sense, have those dashboards of bed availability more publicly available, so that there's a sense that you, as a province, on top of the situation, you have the capacity, you have the functional beds available almost on a daily basis, as like a kind of a dashboard, in a sense, where one's able to give confidence that the province is on track with bed and ICU bed, and also space and casualty and so on availability. Thank you very much, and good luck with the weeks ahead.
Thank you very much. And Boitumelo?
Yeah. So one is, I would just like to commend them for the impressive work that they have done, and to really encourage them to forge ahead. I think you're focusing on the right things. And I think if we continue learning in this way, the outbreaks. Two is, one of the things that crisis provide is to really allow us to ask very tough questions around whether what we are doing is effective, and whether there are more efficient or better ways of doing what we are doing. And I think part of the work that the provinces are doing will help us unpack some of those questions. And again, within our space, the questions around procurement, around compliance, fear of the AG, and the like. Those are issues that we have to confront head on, just so that at the end of the day we have a capable state that can deliver services to the public in a responsive and agile way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we'll take a 5-minute comfort break. Of course, my colleagues here in studio, they still have an opportunity in the next session for further comments. Thank you very much, panelists, for those inputs. Let's take a 5-minute leg stretch.